Вам спасибо большое за вопрос. По поводу наших учений, маневров, развития вооруженных сил. И вы сказали, что Россия в известной степени внесла свой вклад в ту напряженность, которую мы сейчас наблюдаем в мире. Россия внесла свой вклад, но только в том смысле, что она все жестче и жестче защищает свои национальные интересы. Мы не атакуем, в политическом смысле этого слова, мы ни на кого не нападаем, мы только защищаем свои интересы. И недовольство наших западных партнеров, прежде всего американских, связано с тем, что мы делаем именно это, а не с тем, что мы в сфере безопасности допускаем какие-то действия, которые провоцируют напряженность. И я поясню. Вот вы говорите о полетах нашей авиации, в том числе о полетах стратегической авиации. Знаете ли вы, что Россия в начале 90-х годов полностью прекратила, как это делал Советский Союз, полеты нашей стратегической авиации в отдаленных районах патрулирования? Мы полностью прекратили. А американские самолеты стратегические с ядерным оружием продолжали летать. Зачем? Против кого? Кому угрожали? И мы не летали и не летали, не летали и не летали, из года в год. И вот только пару лет, тройку назад возобновили эти полеты. Так кто провоцирует? Мы, что ли? Значит, у нас две базы практически только за границей. И то на террористически опасных направлениях. В Киргизии, после того, как туда зашли боевики из Афганистана, по просьбе киргизских властей, тогда Акаева президента, и в Таджикистане, тоже на границе с Афганистаном. Думаю, что и вы заинтересованы в том, чтобы там было все спокойно. И это обосновано, понятно и ясно. Американские базы по всему земному шару. И вы хотите сказать, что мы ведем себя агрессивно? Ну, здравый смысл-то есть.
President, at the risk of being shot down, the numbers of people who have been killed on the streets of the Philippines since you came to power 6 weeks ago have risen to around 1,000. Now, I know you have been contemptuous of your critics, but they are accusing you of unleashing a national death squad. Where is this going to end? Because some are saying that the social fabric of the Philippines is at risk here.
Good. That's a very good question. Because the other past, in the distant past, no police was ever willing to really work and risk his life. You know, it was a practice before. That's why I said I take full responsibility. You know why? Because they are now encouraged and even brave enough to have a shootout. The standard practice in this system of government is that when you accuse him, they would always file a counter charge and say that there's due process or that they were unarmed and anything, any answer that could give a leverage. And ordinarily, and you can check this out, in the courts, they have to use that leverage against the poor policeman. Now, remember in this country, no lawyer is provided for the policemen and the other men and the security officers when they get into trouble with the law. They are left at the mercy on their own. That was the policy before, and in the previous ones, they are left behind. So when I was mayor, I told them, go ahead, do your duty. But if you feel that you're in carrying out your duty, you will get killed. My God, shoot him first. And they were protected here, and there were cases filed, and I provided the lawyer. And for the time that they are suspended, that is why they are afraid. They face charges in court, then at the same time, when they are accused, they lose the job because they are suspended. And for the time that they are suspended, And the hearing of cases can take you to eternity, as low as it can ever be. The family is not without food.
But with respect, sir, you as a lawyer know
Yes.
better than any of us how important this principle of innocent until proved guilty is.
Look, Padilla said 2 years ago, there are 3 million addicts in this country. That was the last figure. Nobody cared to find out. Now it's my time. So, 2 years ago, between 2 years ago and now, how many do you think were hooked into drugs? Let us give it incremental increase of about, just be liberal about 700,000. So 3,700,000. And the confirmed 600,000 now was surrendered and took the test for drug addiction. How do you call it? Just a problem? Is just a police problem? Or is it really a crisis for this country? It's not even epidemic, my friend. It is pandemic. So what am I supposed to do as a president? Empower the military and the police, for after all, they are there to protect the integrity and preserve the people of the Philippines.
At the risk of gun law, sir.
It can happen. It happens in America. They're shooting the blacks there. It shows on TV. It shows on TV. What's the difference between America and the Philippines? Nothing. So what is surprising here is surprising to us. We say policemen, they're shooting a black guy there. How many times had it happened in the past? That's why you have the violent demonstration. So, would it surprise you and me? Almost the same. 1 case only, 3 cases here. So what? It involves the same principle. Say, for every 1 black there dead, you have about 5 here. And so, does it make this world more livable because there is less killing? When you shoot a black there dead, what is that? Is that not appalling? When you bomb Syria and Iraq, and you kill communities, and you kill children and old people and hospital, what is it? And why is it that United States is not doing anything? I do not read anybody in that stupid body complaining about the stench there of that. Look at the iconic boy that was taken out from the rubble. And he was made to sit in the ambulance, and we saw it. So what's the difference? Life of a criminal, or maybe he was really rubbed out. We cannot discount it. But what do you think that Americans did to the black people there? Is that not rubbing out also? I say, well, it was just one community there, one state of America. Well, but you have there about 10. So what's the difference? Are we here for the counting or the basic principles of human rights? Almost the same.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
So before the start of the summit, there was the issue about the South China Sea and the Hague Court, and Mr. Obama commented on this issue several times, and the chairman of China also commented on this. I would like to hear your opinion on the matter, especially in the context of future Russian military tests in the area.
Together with President Xi Jinping, we have a very friendly relationship, and it goes back years. But I would like to emphasize that he has never requested me to comment on this issue in any way. I've never heard this kind of request from him ever. But of course, we have our own opinion on this matter, and that is that we do not interfere, and we believe that any interference of any other country coming from outside this region would only make the situation worse, and it would only obstruct a solution. We think that third countries that are not from this region should not interfere. That's number one. Number two, as for this Court of Arbitration in Hague and its decisions, we are in solidarity with China, and we support China's decision not to recognize the decision of this court. This is not a political position, it is purely legal, and that is the fact that any arbitration must be initiated by the conflicting parties, and the Court of Arbitration must hear the position of both parties. As you know, China never turned to the Court of Arbitration in Hague, and the court never examined China's position. So how can they subscribe and adhere to that decision? And we support China on this issue. As for the military exercises, they do not affect anyone's security, and they only are meant to strengthen the national security of both China and Russia.
Did Xi Jinping try?
Philippines, like the president has claimed, to be able to break out of the orbit of the U.S.?
Well, the problem with President Duterte is that sometimes it's not clear whether his statements are just pure bluster and braggadocio, or are they really final policy statement? He says a lot of eye-catching things, but they're yet to be confirmed. Well, without a question, Duterte personally wants a much more independent foreign policy. He has a lot of reservations towards the United States. He's in fact a self-described socialist. I think a lot of this rhetoric also has to be taken against the context of growing criticism from the United States of Mr. Duterte's war on drugs. So Mr. Duterte is also very irritated with the Western criticism of his war on drugs. So perhaps this is his way of getting back at them. But I think more importantly, with Duterte set to visit China very soon in the coming weeks, he's trying to signal to China that he's a different kind of Filipino president. He's not a lackey or proxy of US. He's an independent president. And in fact, he's willing to tinker with relations with the US as a form of concessions. I won't be surprised if he really suspends joint patrols and joint exercises with the U.S. in the South China Sea as a form of confidence-building measure with China, provided China also gives the Philippines significant concessions in the South China Sea. I think this is part of a bargain that he's looking at.
Okay, Mr. Walsh, time for you to talk also. What is it exactly, do you think, behind the statement made by the Filipino president, Mr. Duterte? Is it of buttering up of words right before a visit to Beijing? Is it a personal dispute with the United States as a result of his war against drugs inside the Philippines? Or is it a strategic shift that he originally thought when he comes into the office? What nature is it?
Yeah, well, yeah, I like my colleague, I think it's probably a combination of the first two. He definitely is a prickly personality. He is not unlike a certain presidential candidate here in the United States. He's liable to talk off the cuff, but there may also be some shrewd bargaining calculations going on here that by sort of pushing back on the U.S., he's in a better position to turn to China and extract some concessions, and perhaps to turn then back to the United States and extract concessions. But I think the core point that was made is the right one, which is we're going to have to wait and see, because a lot gets said, and it may be coming from the heart, but there's a difference between words and policy. And then even this morning in the Philippines, the ex-president Ramos, who was somewhat of a mentor or supporter of this president, has urged him to be cautious on his foreign policy. So he's in his first 100 days. We're going to need a little more time to actually figure out what's going on, and he's going to hit new bumps in the road himself. Right. I think this is a style, though very popular right now, is going to wear thin after time. So I'd say stay tuned, but I don't expect a dramatic formal change in the alliance anytime soon.
Well, Mr. Yang, you have always been staying tuning So from the Chinese perspective, what does that mean? If I could shape the question in another way for you to express yourself, how does China see the sea change difference between President Duterte and his predecessor? One, of course, had a huge problem with China, South China Sea, many of the other issues. President Duterte apparently want to break away from the United States and want to emphasize on China, Russia. How does China take this?
Well, first of all, I like the very creative term of alliance of commerce. That's really something
That's
new.
what he said.
Right?
He said, I'm going to
he said,
create some new alliance of commerce.
So in nature, he wants to make a sophisticated balance, strategic balance between the powers in this region by making use of all of the tools, military, mainly rely on the United States, economically, commercially, they may rely on China, and combined with, rely, even with Russia, importing some, buying some Russian weapons, increasing some imports and exports with Russia. All of those are possible. By making all of the things, I don't think Duterte will break completely the ties with the United States. To the contrary, he will make greater efforts to maintain the stability of the ties with the U.S. Meanwhile, to amend, even strengthen and improve the ties with China and Russia, so that the Philippines can get a better position among the powers.
That what probably is his plan. We don't know exactly what his plan is. Sometimes politicians' words are different from exactly what they're thinking or their actions in any country. But let me ask you this. If I could read to you, Professor Hidarian, this quote, President Duterte himself, some say, is largely responsible for this huge change that we have seen with the relations between China and the Philippines, relations between the Philippines and the United States. He earlier said this. Let's play this. I will establish new alliances for trade and commerce, and you are scheduled to hold war games again, which China does not want. This is something he said about the war games. But the question is, Professor Hidarian, is he able single-handedly change the earlier direction of the Filipino policies? Let me just mention a few things before you answer a question. You got American development aid, you got American military aid, you've also got quite a huge commercial ties with the United States. You have got a lot of personal interactions between the Filipino politicians and the American side. So the question is, even if President Duterte had this view or has this view, is it possible? Professor Hidarian.
Right. I mean, a lot of strategists in the Philippines think that the previous president, Benigno Aquino, was too confrontational towards China. And even though he may have scored a legal victory at The Hague, the ability of the Philippines to leverage that, to extract concessions from China was under question. In fact, there was a fear that after the arbitration case, tensions will increase and there could be military confrontation. So at this point in time, a lot of people are supporting Duterte because he sounds like a pragmatist, a reasonable man who's saying that we don't want war, we cannot win a war, and the number one thing we have to do right now is to de-escalate the tensions and build bilateral negotiations with China. And I think that is why he's getting still a lot of support. Nonetheless, as mentioned a while ago by Jim, you have his chief negotiator with China, former President Ramos, also now criticizing him. Because some people feel that while the Philippines has to be a little bit more independent from U.S. and not too subservient to U.S., it shouldn't move away too much from U.S. and jump into the Chinese camp. It has to equibalance or have an equiproximate relationship. And if Duterte really goes ahead to try to sever ties with the US, he could really trigger a political backlash among the Philippine security establishment, if not the military, which is very dependent on American military, logistics, financial, and intelligence assistance.
Mr. Yang, it also has a lot to do about China's attitude. It's like a bouncing board diplomacy, is how you act and how you interact against one another. So what does China think about the place of the Philippines in the regional strategy of China? Where is the Philippines?
Well, now the Filipinos' policies conducted by Duterte is in fast changing. So now it's too early to make a conclusion about the new president's policy towards South China Sea, towards the multiple powers. However, China sincerely welcome the new signals that is designed to cooling down the tensions. For example, it's saying he'd like to reopen the dialogues. That is the calling for long time by China. And so I think Beijing now is ready to restart the dialogues and the negotiations with Filipinos, and meanwhile has been ready for a wide range of cooperations with the Philippines if the new government really wants to do. So basically, no matter what true intention of the new governments, if the new governments conducted in sincere cooperation, no matter it's on South China Sea or other areas, China will certainly give a positive reaction.
Mr. Walsh, we haven't heard once, but we heard several times coming from President Duterte that the U.S. has failed us. That's his words. Without explaining exactly how the U.S. has failed or what exactly he was referring to. Having said that, though, what would the recent words and in the future possible actions coming from Duterte, President Duterte, mean for the U.S. overall planning, whether in the South China Sea and also largely Asia-Pacific region?
Yeah, well, if this policy, if his policy actually resulted in a change of alliances or something major like that, it would have a big impact on the U.S. No doubt about it. But we're a long way from that. You know, we've already had a couple of reversals. You'll remember there was that little incident where he called out President Obama, told him he was going to tell him to go to hell just before they were supposed to meet at the UN. Then that meeting was canceled by the U.S. Then we had sort of a fudging over, and then they ended up meeting anyway, but you know, in an impromptu, brief way. You know, that may be a metaphor for what we see here, which is sharp words in public, followed by, you know, the spokesperson sort of massaging it, watering it down a little, and then eventually some sort of awkward reconciliation. It's hard to know. I think a lot, and I would defer to my Filipino colleague on this. I think a lot will depend also, that foreign policy will be influenced on how successful he is in his domestic agenda. And I think there's much criticism deserved over this war on drugs and all the vigilante killings, but it also has to be said that he has had an impressive 100 days on his domestic policy, making lots of changes, and that his poll numbers are very high, and that the Filipino people support the war on drugs, and probably feel, you know, let's face it, this was part of an imperial U.S. past, the U.S. taking the Philippines. So it wouldn't be surprising if there was some lingering resentment there, and that a nationalist and a populist could take advantage of it. But I'm guessing, and again, I'll defer to my colleague, but I'm guessing if he continues to be successful on his domestic agenda, and this doesn't wear out over time, that will give him more freedom of action on his foreign policy.
Before we go, gentlemen, I do want to know a very important question, your answers to it. That is, will the Philippines or the US or China be able to play one power or one country against the other on this interesting trilateral relations, if we could use this word, among these three countries. Of course, I would love to begin with the Philippines. Can Philippines do that? U.S. against China, China against U.S.?
Well, I think a lot of other mid-sized countries like South Korea provide a very good template for how the Philippines could move forward. The United States and South Korea have a solid military relationship. South Korea and China have disputes in the Yellow Sea, and yet if you look at the economic relationship between South Korea and China, they're very robust. And despite some diplomatic irritations between Seoul and Beijing, it seems they can get along very well overall. So I think the Philippines can learn from the experience of countries like South Korea by trying to have an equi-proximate relationship, not to play this one superpower against the other. This is not the Cold War period. Duterte is not a Gamal Abdel Nasser. This is the 21st century. You cannot play superpowers against each other, but you can have a reasonably positive and constructive relationship with all of them.
All right. Mr. Walsh, what do you think? The U.S. against China with the help of the Philippines or without?
Well, I agree with my colleague. I do think there's a bargaining space here. The Philippines is important to the U.S. The Philippines is important to China. That should give the new president some room to maneuver. Countries have done this before. It's a classic move of balancing one party against another. But I also agree there isn't going to be a dramatic shift in the chessboard here, and that it is possible. I mean, obviously, both China and the U.S. are important in the region, militarily, economically, and it will depend in part also on how China behaves. If China takes a more aggressive stance, that will cause problems, domestic problems for the Philippine president, and that may affect it. So there is certainly the potential here for not a revolution in relations, but a recalibration in which the Philippines repositions itself a little more closely to China. But again, that'll depend on how all the other players play this game. And so it remains an open and unsettled question.
I see. Well, Mr. Yang, you probably can help us a little bit more with the plots.
Yep, I'm glad to say I really agree with my two colleagues' view. Say no possibility and no intention among the three. Say make one power to against it, to be against the other. What I want to add is President Duterte's predecessor really played such a game by borrowing American power to against China, but such a game definitely damage Filipinos' national interest. That is the basic reason why Duterte began to adjust their foreign policy.
Before we go, very briefly from every one of you, what to expect Filipino President Duterte's first visit to China, official visit as the president during the 100 days in the office? Mr. Walsh, briefly.
I think it's going to go well for him. I think he's going to get literally the red carpet treatment here, and he's going to bask in it, and it's going to pay political dividends for him. So I expect it to go very well.
Professor Hidarian?
Well, it's definitely going to break the ice in bilateral relationship and will contribute significantly to improvement of bilateral ties. But don't forget, he'll be visiting Japan the following week, so also expect the Japanese to also roll the red carpet for him. So interesting times.
A lot of red carpets to walk on, I guess. Mr. Yang, final words.
Yeah, two brief points. One point is the two presidents will got a joint efforts to calming down further the tension on South China Sea, so that that will pave a way for the dialogues. And secondly, that will restore the broad range of cooperations between China and the Philippines. That will pave a way, lay a base for the cooperation.
For more on the U.S.-Filipino relations in Beijing, we're having Mr. Teng Jianquan, Director of the American Studies Department at the China Institute of International Studies. In Washington, D.C., joining us is Ivan Eland, who is a Senior Fellow and Director of the Center on Peace and Liberty at the Independent Institute. Meanwhile, joining us from Manila in the Philippines, we are having Mr. Richard Hidarian, Political Science Professor at De La Salle University in the Philippines. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. First of all, Mr. Hidarian, what do you make of eventually the meeting between President Obama and President Duterte after earlier quite a dramatic exchange between the two sides?
Well, the dust-up between President Obama and Duterte in some ways was not completely unexpected because a few weeks ago, President Duterte also made expletive statements about the American ambassador, Philip Goldberg. Duterte has been breaking one taboo after the other when it comes to relationship with the U.S. So somehow you were not totally surprised by this. What we were surprised about is when President Duterte, after trying to do some damage control and releasing a regret statement, and then the next day during the East Asia Summit, he made another criticism of the United States about its historical injustices against Filipino Muslims when Obama was in the crowd. So from what I know, they did not shake each other's hands at the end of the East Asia Forum. So in many ways, this represents some temporary diplomatic setback, but I believe that the fundamentals of bilateral relations will continue.
Mr. Eland, what do you think Washington makes of this new president in the Philippines? Obviously, he has quite strong personality and at times would have outbursts of words. What does Washington make of this personality?
Well, I think they think he's another Donald Trump, only a Filipino Donald Trump, and I think they're probably not too far from that. You may not like a country's policies, but when you disrespect their leader, I mean, no one likes that, and it's a bad thing to do under any circumstances. I think the real problem is that the United States goes around to these leaders and begs them to be U.S. allies when it should be the other way around. The United States is defending the Philippines, is defending Japan, is defending South Korea, is defending Taiwan against what all these countries are leery of, a rising China. Well, if the U.S. didn't do that and retracted its defense perimeter, you would see those countries being really nice to the United States because they want the trade and they want the economic benefits of dealing with China, but they also want the U.S. protection in case they have a dispute with China, such as over the South China Sea or the East China Sea.
Mr. Tang, here in Beijing, what do you think President Duterte is trying to do from the Chinese way of looking at him? I mean, on the one hand, he is still finger pointing to China to a certain extent, for example, during the East Asia Summit. But at the same time, he also, with his words, distanced himself and possibly the Philippines from the United States, temporarily at least, it seems. What does China make of this reality?
Duterte has been in the office of the presidency of the Philippines already for 2 months, and so far we cannot give a very clear-cut interpretation of his policy toward China. Sometimes he said good words to China, some said he said a bad word toward the United States. But I think at least the 2 points I'd like to mention here. The first, he is realistic as compared with the previous president, Aquino III. And he's from the grassroots. He's quite familiar with the situation of the Filipino society. And he'd like to improve the social life of the country. This is the #1 job for him. And the second, the criticism against the United States and against President Obama actually is anger from the recent years' cooperation between the two countries. The United States only gave some lip service and no real support or assistance, especially after the announcement of the ruling of the arbitration. And the Secretary of State, John Kerry, gave a very clear statement saying there is nothing to do with the United States in this regard. So I think this is actually anger from the Philippines. Duterte just expressed the anger from that country.
All right. Mr. Hidarian, I want to come back to you now. It's very important to understand for many in this region What exactly does the Filipino president have in mind? What is his priority? How does he see the domestic issues, for example, the drug war going on over there, and his spats with some of the political enemies he had at home, vis-a-vis the Filipino president's new drawn international strategy, also in the region toward China? What do you think?
Yeah, three things very quickly. The first thing is that President Duterte is signaling his independence from the United States by so explicitly standing up to the United States and criticizing the United States. He's trying to say to the rest of the region, including China, that the Philippines is not the proxy of America, that it can think for itself and it can decide for itself. Which brings us to the second point. There's a clear point of disagreement between the Duterte administration and Washington on the issue of human rights. It seems that President Duterte is completely unwilling to consider any criticism, especially from the West and from the United Nations, with respect to allegation of extrajudicial activities here in the Philippines. So he's willing to stand up to the U.S. on that, and he's very irritable. So President Obama said that when he's going to meet Duterte, he's going to discuss human rights front and center, and I think that ticked off Duterte and may explain his response. And lastly, yes, it's true that Duterte says different things about China, but more than 90% of what he says about China is about peace, is about engagement and bilateral negotiation, which is very different from what was the position of the previous president.
Right. Mr. Eland, both President Duterte from the Philippines and his administration important members have been talking about the Philippines' relations with China vis-a-vis its relation with the United States. A foreign minister quote, if I could, is suggesting good relations with China does not mean we are going to weaken our friendship with the United States. This is a direct quote from the Filipino foreign minister. Does Washington believe so?
Well, I think Washington probably does see it all or nothing. I think the United States policy still has recollections of the Cold War, when small countries had a lot of power over the U.S. because it was just desperate for allies. And I think the United States should stay neutral in these disputes in the South and East China Seas. But implicitly, it doesn't, because it's allied with some of the countries on the other side of China. I don't see, I think China's territorial aspirations there are completely unreasonable, but that's not the problem of the United States. And I think the United States really ought to, and Donald Trump has pointed out this in the presidential campaign, the United States should question some of these alliances and what we're getting out of it. It's makes our foreign policy very inflexible, and it allows leaders like the Philippines and other leaders to do these things. And I don't fault them for doing that. He wants to be independent of the United States. He wants to show China that they can get along, but he's also doing that within the under the shield of the U.S. And the United States should be careful, because this guy is very volatile, and he could get the United States into a shooting war with China or some other country there that the United States doesn't want to be in.
Okay, Mr. Hidarian, I want to also have an assessment of what Manila believes Washington is willing to do for itself. I mean, for Manila, of course. There was, back in the year 1951, mutual defense agreement. That was a very long time. But now, over the past few years, there's something called the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement between the two sides. And the Philippines is trying to persuade America to protect the Philippines by having more American troops to be stationed in the Philippines and have joint military exercises with the Philippines. But what would these mean for Manila, convincing Washington to be on its side, no matter what it is?
Yes, for the Duterte administration, clearly the United States is not doing enough. The U.S. never clarified whether the Scarborough Shoal or other land features claimed by the Philippines in the South China Sea will be defended by the United States if there will be a war between the Philippines and China. Unlike what is the U.S. position on the Senkaku Diaoyu, when they said clearly that falls within the Mutual Defense Treaty with Japan. So on one hand, Duterte is angry that the U.S. is not giving enough commitments. And on the other hand, if he tries to reach out to China, it's possible that he may be open open to put some restrictions on further American access to Philippine bases. Remember, the Subic and Clark have not yet been opened up to American forces under the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement. So that's still up for negotiation between him and the U.S. and sure between China and the Philippines too.
Right, Mr. Tang, very complicated picture. You see a lot of moving factors all going on at the same time. So what does China make of this? President Duterte said openly, despite sometimes his moody words, he suggested that the Philippines is not going to, in public, talk about the dispute between China and the Philippines toward the South China Sea issue, but rather to negotiate and discussion with a closed door. How does China take that gesture? And well knowing what is going on right now between the Philippines and the United States?
Actually, after the ruling of the so-called arbitration by the Philippines, all the parties concerned in the South China Sea have returned to the original point. They all promised to, do the negotiation
and exercise restraint
and restrain their, muscle and not to show so much muscle in this game. And actually, there is a fundamental change, I think, in the balance of power in this region. The United States and China would like to have more engagement in not only in trade, not only in security, but this time they prefer to go together, to have more cooperation with ASEAN countries in security and also in economy. And this is the fundamental change of balance of power in this region. And so I think the Filipino president at this moment, he is quite familiar with the change. And the best choice for the Philippines to go ahead, to have a good, best diplomacy, is to cooperate with the big powers. We used to say the ASEAN countries would like to have more cooperation in security with the United States and more cooperation in economy with China. But this time, after the fundamental change of balance of power, they have to find a good solution, to find the best choice to maintain the balanced relation with China and with the United States.
Mr. Yilan, following what Mr. Tang in Beijing just said, I want to also have your assessment. What has changed regarding the issue of South China Sea? Have all sides, well, they're suggesting we need to exercise restraint, at the same time done some soul searching about how important really is this issue to all of them, and how strategically they want to approach this? Or this is only going to be one of those issues that are on the list to be handled? This is very important. Is it still going to be the priority issue, Mr. Yilan?
Well, I would hope that it would, people would reconsider what's been going on, because I think it's very dangerous for all these countries to be jousting in the South China Sea. And I'm hoping that the U.S. doesn't get dragged into it. From my perspective, the U.S. really shouldn't be caring about, a bunch of rocks in the South China Sea, which is really what the dispute is. The United States should stay neutral, but it should be really neutral, because it's not now. It says it is, but it has alliances both in the South China Sea and the East China Sea with one side of the dispute. And I think, you can say that there's a web of economic interaction, but when it comes down to security, there's China and then there's everybody else. At least that's how a lot of these smaller countries feel. And the U.S. is, by treaty, required to defend these countries. And so, but what do we get out of it? We haven't gotten much from Japan and South Korea economically, and we're certainly not going to get anything from the Philippines economically. So I think Mr. Trump is right in a certain respect, and that is we need to reconsider our alliances in the Eastern.
Well, Mr. Yilan,
we really need them anymore.
Mr. Yilan, you just revealed to the rest of the world you're probably is one of those Trump supporters. But having said that, let me go to Mr.
No, I'm not a Trump. I'm not a Trump supporter, but I think he does. I think he does make sense on that particular point. I would not vote for Donald Trump. I think he's a wild man, and I think the leader of the Philippines is right up there with him.
I wouldn't check your track record when it comes to voting, but let's just put that joke aside. Mr. Hidarian, okay, there are a lot of things facing the Philippines right now, what is going on inside the country, and also at the same time, your most important ally, the United States, they have an election going on just in a few months. Two candidates have very different opinions. And also, you have this China and the United States, at least during the G20 summit, they apparently worked together even on the climate change issue, which has been applauded by the rest of the world.
Yeah.
And also, you have China, in a way, willing to talk to the Philippines about issues of common concern for negotiation. So what would all of these factors mean for Duterte's administration's choices when it comes to the hard issues between China and Philippines? Mr. Hidarian.
Right. Yeah. I mean, first of all, with respect to China, it's very likely that within a month, President Duterte will visit China. This is what I'm hearing, that he may choose China as his first state visit. And that will be very important because the optics will be very clear. After this dust-up with President Obama, after his gay slur comment against the American ambassador, now he's choosing China possibly as his first state visit, which is very different from other Filipino presidents who almost always chose the United States as the first state visit.
Well, we'll see
now
what
that
happens.
will have an impact on U.S. elections, because that will put pressure on Hillary Clinton to prove that President Obama is not weak and what's happening with the Philippines is not as a result of the pivot Asia or the failure of the Democrats' foreign policy. And for sure, Donald Trump will make the most out of this.
We don't want to go to Donald Trump's story, but Mr. Tang, without further commenting on Mr. Trump's strategies, let me ask you before we go. Is this an opportunity? Or is this going to be just a break from further contest and further tension in the region?
As we mentioned just now, I think the transition of power in this region has been under its way, and there is no terminal at so far. I think we should have a close look at the development, and I think the situation in the South China Sea actually is a security dilemma for the two big powers in this region, and the ASEAN countries are very cautious about the competition between the two big powers. They worry about the competition. They worry about the possible clash between the two major powers. So they change their policy toward the United States and toward China. So this is a bad choice, but I think we still haven't found the good solution out of the security dilemma between the two big powers.
What about the president of the Philippines? He was annoyed over U.S. criticism of his human rights records. Rodrigo Duterte sounding pretty definitive about severing ties with Washington. When he traveled for a state visit to China, he said he would forego an international ruling in his favor over disputed South China Sea fishing rights in favor of talks and pivoting away from the former colonial power, the United States.
America has lost me. And will I realign myself in your ideological flow, and maybe I will also go to Russia to talk to Putin and tell him that there are three of us against the world. Your Honors, in this venue, I announce my separation from the United States, both in military, not maybe social because the Philippines, both in military but economics also.
All right, that's what he said in Beijing. He's just landed back in his hometown of Davao City, and he's saying, no, I'm not severing economic ties. What I was really saying was separation of foreign policy. Will the real Rodrigo Duterte please stand up?
I think the first Duterte we saw was the real one. He's not a nice guy. He's out of control. Aaron used the term out-of-control narcissist, I think, earlier to reflect Donald Trump. This guy really is the real deal.
Is it a foretaste of what a Trump presidency?
Well, I think Donald would be much more careful on statements like that once he becomes president.
Well,
Maybe he now
he's.
But I think this the Philippines is a very important ally of the United States. It's not going to move into the orbit of China very quickly, despite his interest in doing that. It's another sign, again, I think, of President Obama's lead from behind. We should have been working this guy more carefully. we should be condemning the extrajudicial killings of thousands of people in the
The
Philippines.
U.S. has, and the Obama administration
Not
has.
not loudly enough.
There was that
should be
scrapped
followed up
meeting
with
at the ASEAN summit.
Yeah, that's actually what's led to the problem, because Duterte, like Trump, I mean, in a sense, he really is the Donald Trump of the Philippines. He's so incredibly thin-skinned that it was the American condemnation of his drugs crackdown that made him react and call
Again, I
Obama a
think
son
we're
of a
going
whore.
way too far. Donald Trump's not going to do thousands of extrajudicial killings. And I don't think he's going to announce one day that England's no longer an ally of the United States. So I think this guy is, and I think Obama, the Wall Street Journal has a story that Duterte came up to Obama and asked to speak with him, and Obama shuffled him off to an aide, a low-level aide. Duterte was deeply insulted. He's obviously a narcissist. Obama needs to be much more engaged in world leadership, and I think some of the problems we're seeing around the world is his failure to engage, and we see this on the home front.
But about Duterte, what's going to happen now then? Which one?
Well, I think that luckily this seems to be Duterte himself. I mean, it's his personality. He obviously harbours a lot of rancor going back a long way regarding America, and his aides are horrified. The trade minister is horrified, and so I think now that he'll hopefully step back, and he must, because this is hugely important strategically in the South China Sea. There is a power struggle between China and America, and there it is true that Obama has been taking a back seat.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there, unfortunately. Caught up by the clock. I want to thank Ann Penkett, Aaron Zaleski, and Christopher Ruddy. Stay with us, though, because our Media Watch segment is next.